Okay, thanks a lot, and welcome to my talk about from resilient autonomous driving to cyber physical systems on a chip, cyber resilient systems on a chip. My name is Markus Volp. I'm from the head of the CritiX team at S&T, which is the Interdisciplinary Center for Security, Reliability and Trust at the University of Luxembourg. So you may ask yourself why I'm here, and I'll give you the answer in a second, but let's first tell you what we are worried about or what we are doing. If you look over the years, then we have seen in the past a significant increase in the attack sophistication. And if you would look around the bubble in the top right, you see the modern attacks which attack hardware like Spectre and Meltdown and so on. At the same time, the expertise required by the hackers, they went down because now all the tools are scripted. You can essentially download them from the darknet and so on. So in a way, me and my team, we are worried on what's left over when you really combine the top teams, the top skills with the best tools which you can find and expose your systems against these kind of threats. So what we are trying to do is really build systems that can operate through and safely operate through and survive attacks and automatically recover from them. Now, who are we? You already know me. My name is Markus Volp. I'm associate professor at the University of Luxembourg, and my specialties is microkernels and real-time systems. And I collected around me a team of 5 PhD students and 5 postdocs. And among those, you actually see one of yours, because Giulio, he's also in the audience. He actually studied at this university and came to Luxembourg after his PhD to do his postdoc time. And now that the postdoc time is slowly coming to an end, let's see what comes next in his career. Maybe becoming a professor here, maybe somewhere else. I mean, at least that's what I hope. So in CritiX, we are really worried about fault and intrusion tolerance. So to make sure that if something fails, we can tolerate that, we can safely operate through it. About resilience, which is actually bringing back the system to the state where it should be. And of course, in this interplay between security and safety. Now, I started my talk with autonomous driving, and this slide is essentially telling you, we are late, we are damn late. Autonomous driving has been proposed in a news article in 1957. And by that, I mean fully autonomous driving, mind off the road. The people here are playing a nice game with their kids, and that's how it should be. You can't expect a human driver to pay attention if the robot does it 95% of the time. We won't be able to react in the remaining 5%. So we really need to go to autonomous driving. The picture went better, it's still an illusion, we are not yet there. And that's one of the challenges. However, at the same time, and you have seen that in the movies, there is a lot of things which we need to worry about once hackers manage to take over our vehicles. In Fast and Furious 8, a group of hackers actually caused this nice CGI-inspired traffic jam. I don't want to see that in reality. And there are already researchers who demonstrated that it's actually possible to hack in a Jeep and control the Jeep, driving it backward, controlling it really on the road, by just having your laptop in the back and entering through the radio signal and remotely controlling a car. So it's not an illusion. It's done in the lab. It's done under a controlled environment. But now assume that your favorite nation state agency, pick any letter combinations that you like, Chinese, US, Europe, I don't care, manages and uses that for a hybrid attack. I don't want to live in such a world. So for that reason, we need to make sure that our vehicles become resilient to cyber attacks, but also resilient to all kinds of accidental faults. Because if something works, then it's also doomed to fail. Simply because it works, it can fail. Now, if you look at an autonomous vehicle, and I picked an electric one here, you already see that there are a lot of systems which have to work correctly. One of the things, for example, is the battery charging, which kind of just do the math yourself. We are putting a lot of energy in essentially no time into a chemical system which has to respond well to these kind of chargers. Don't tamper with that. There is the electrical, the autonomous driving functionality. So we are putting all kinds of sensor on that. And I have seen your car, so that's quite impressive work. And then, of course, we have to make sense of what the car is seeing and how the car is reacting in its environment. Now, if you look at the autonomous functionality, we take all this information from the sensors, feed that into AI, which is up there in the brain, so the main computer of your autonomous car, into a perception module to find out how the environment around us looks like. We take information from localization like GPS and other signals to know where we are, and feed the prediction of what we have sensed on our environment. Because, I mean, we can't already drive in a scenario where we just take a snapshot. We also need to understand how people are moving, how the pedestrians are moving, how the other vehicles are moving on the road, because we want to drive as well. And in that sense, we need to kind of take what we see, predict what the future states will be, and then do a plan. And the plan essentially gives us a trajectory to follow. Now, once the trajectory is computed, the rest is more or less trivial, because then I just kind of steer my car to the left, to the right. If I'm too far off, I'm steering in the opposite direction. I mean, I'm sure you could have done that in the first semester. If you haven't done it, I pretty much assume you do that. So the control part is actually one of the easier things. But now it comes again to the other side, where we're going into the driving subsystem, running the control algorithms on ECU, so the electronic control units. And there we are faced with hardware issues, with an operating system, with things where we actually need. Now, what I would like to do in my talk is really share with you some of the results which we have found out. So to inspire you that maybe kind of looking at cars also from a cybersecurity perspective might be something interesting. And I know that part of you are already doing that. And maybe there is a chance of you kind of following in Julius' footsteps at some stage. So what we did in this first project is essentially tackle the brain. And we tackled that in a situation where we kind of have the cars on the road on our own. Now, of course, before we can go there, let's talk a little bit about how we deal with cyber attacks in general. If you go all the way back to the first generation protection systems, and that's something like in the 80s, 90s, and so on, so last century, we worked a lot on access control and cryptography and these kind of things, so to prevent intrusions from happening. But then we found out that despite all these measures, hackers managed to break into these system still. So then what we tried next is essentially to detect intrusions and to limit their damage. That's all the intrusion detection systems which you see nowadays, the firewalls, all the boundaries, the perimeter protection which you have in your systems. But some attacks still succeeded in order to get through these perimeter protection. So in particular, because hackers may be stealthy. They are not going and saying, like in capture the flag events, I got it, I'm now the boss, I'm kind of printing something on the screen of your car. They try to remain stealthy until there is a point where they can cause some maximum damage. So in this case, we need a new paradigm, and that's to tolerate attacks. Now, unfortunately, so that's when it then comes to intrusion detection, intrusion tolerance, to these big boards where cybersecurity response teams actually observe systems and try to manually intervene. But what we found out at this stage was also that while tolerating, we are actually losing resources. And so essentially we need to now restore our system. If you have one instance, one component compromised, and this component is lost, so you either need to find a way to live without that component, but you put it in for some purpose in the first place. So we better need to do that. And now, when talking about vehicles, and in particular autonomous vehicles, we are also talking about a system which has to act in real time. It's no longer correct if you hit the brake, if there is a child running on the road, if that happens 5 minutes after you have rolled over your car, over the kid. So there is this timely aspect. You need to respond before the deadline, and you need to guarantee that response. And now it turns out that fault tolerance people and real-time people didn't even talk to each other for the last 10 years. So they are only now starting to cover these kind of holes. And of course, that's one of the things where we also want to contribute. So what we would like to do is taking your system, looking at fault tolerance, which is essentially the property to deliver the intended outcome despite unanticipated and adverse cyber events, to buy us the time, losing resources in the process. We admit that we lose resources while there is an attack ongoing, but then we need the second aspect, and that's resilience, or the recovery from or adjustment to misfortune or change. If you look at resilience in the dictionary, the best thing which I found there is actually to resume the original shape or position after being bent, stretched, or compressed. So it's not kind of just resilience to cyber attacks as we are using it here. It's also kind of, if you squash a ball, then it's resilient because it can kind of jump back to the, or move back to the original form. And that's a very interesting paradigm, because this illustrates how we can actually apply the same schemes, the same idea, and build our systems. We just tolerate the attack here. We make sure that the attacker is confined here, that it can't use a foothold in the system to break out and damage other things. And then we can kind of establish the functionality here and then finally repair what he has taken over. And that's essentially when we close the cycle, because we recover what we lost and we change and what we got learned and what got learned about how to attack the system. So in that sense, we have this continuous fault tolerance resilient cycle. Now, let me introduce you in very few minutes. I mean, I'm giving an entire lecture about that, how that can work in principle, so one of the techniques. Assume you have a client, which is this person here on the left. It sends a request to a system, and we want to have the system tolerate one fault. Now that means if all units of the system is correctly, we can send it to one unit and we get the response. To anticipate that there is a failure, we might also have additional components there. Like we might have a second component. And if we would have a perfect detection mechanism, which is the correct result out of the two results which are given, then that would be enough, because then we can always kind of pick the correct result from the correct component. Unfortunately, we don't always know what the correct result is, but we know that the majority to which the majority of the components agrees, that's the correct result. And that's essentially the idea. So we start our system, we give it the same, we invoke it with the same value, and then we do a majority voting in the end to find the two matching solutions, which then give us the correct answers, without any prior knowledge about the type of the answers that we expect here. Now, of course, we are losing resources, so we can't do that forever. The moment the adversary will have managed to break into one of these components, it will try to break into the second component and until he gets a majority. And in particular, if we are using identical components, then he has already learned how to attack our first component before we can actually do something about that. So for that reason, we can't use exactly the same component. We need to create diversity. So to implement the same functionality in so much different ways that the adversary needs to learn for each component knew how to attack that component. It can't be the same attack code applying and killing all of our components. Now, again, we would lose components over time, but hopefully by that time we have then managed to re-establish a new version which the attacker has never seen. And that's called rejuvenation, and that's another technique which kind of comes into this. So fault tolerance gives us this temporary security of one fault, but then we have to apply diversity and rejuvenation to re-establish that to get the continuity. Now, of course, things in the previous picture were quite easy because we didn't have state updates. We always invoked with the same value. And in reality, it can be also that clients are malicious, that we get wrong inputs, essentially. And in this case, the system which you see here won't work. We actually need an additional replica. So instead of 3, we now need 4 replicas to tolerate one fault. And we need to have another phase, which essentially is the first phase of telling what kind of operation do we want to do. And only if we have agreed on that operation, we can then actually do the operation. You can do that in these kind of protocols, which are kind of the PBFT style protocols, but the more modern versions centralize back all the communication to have a more linear communication pattern between them and to speed up the system. So that's essentially, in 2 to 3 minutes, the state of the art of research on resilience, fault tolerance, and so on. Now, the problem is that this is not enough, and I have to apologize, we are presenting here the PDF and not the PowerPoint, so normally there would be this car driving. And the insight here is fault tolerance or resilience or actually safety, safe driving, if you are on your own, that's easy. You have the road, you have the sideways, there are no pedestrians, you are literally on your own, no traffic, like maybe for receivers that's a bad example, but in Luxembourg, in the south, where we have our university, in the night, nothing happens. You can drive on the roads, you are on your own. So if you are on your own, then there are easy solutions. You can just stop in the middle of the road. That's perfectly fine. If you are not on your own, then it's getting much more complicated, because if you are not stopping, and I mean, the animation goes, the first car driving, the other one crashing into it. That's why you have the crash sign here. If you are not on your own, then it's much more complicated. You need to agree with the others what you are doing, that you need to know to stop the car, and that you need to take actions. But do you realize something? You are no longer alone. So it's not only the resources in your car which need to provide for safety under these kind of situations. It's actually the resources of all the cars taken together. If we can make them talk to each other, if we can establish a cooperation to handle failures. And that's what we did. So essentially we took the sensor signals of all the cars and we projected what the cars see also onto the other car. And even though the other car has failed in this situation, so it can no longer drive autonomously, we call it a brainless car. In this situation, there are other cars around which can still drive autonomously. Not all of them are correct. Some of them might be malicious, and also roadside units might be malicious, because an attacker might have taken over these units and might remain stealthy. Not have yet disabled the autonomous driving functionality, but of course it is there, and maybe he wants the other car to crash into something. So in that situation, what we need is, of course, resilience, but also we need this kind of idea, we need to carry over this idea that you can actually use resources which are not in your own car to help out in that situation. So what did we do? We took the normal driving stack, and that's, in this case, Apollo. The car is driving to find, for example, in the Baidu cars. You could use AutoWare and anything else. I'm interested to learn what you are using, actually. We do an affine transformation. So just kind of this position, he's looking in that direction. And we project all what we have detected and predicted into the ego perspective of the other car. Now with that, we can essentially instantiate another planning component, and it's the same planning component which we already have in our driving stack. And with that exact same planning component, the only difference is that we feed it the projected prediction. We would be able to compute a trajectory and validate that it's working for the other car, for the car that has lost the ability to drive autonomously. And that's all. Now, all that a car which has lost this ability still needs to do, it still needs to be able to somehow communicate, but that's easily done with the small ECUs which you have in your cars right now. So an ARM processor can easily engage in communication. And we need to verify the trajectory. And now, again, this is the consensus problem. Reach agreement on a trajectory which the majority of cars have agreed on. The interesting part here is it does not be exactly the trajectory. Any trajectory which has been validated, which has been confirmed to be safe by a majority of the surrounding cars will do the job. Because all we are interested in is, does this car drive safely? It is even possible to chop up the trajectory into smaller units and say, okay, maybe this car down here is this one, and truck, they have confirmed the first part of the trajectory, and the roadside units, the truck and the golden one, have confirmed the other part of the trajectory. Then we still have a perfectly valid trajectory. So the only condition is it should start where the car is currently, and it should drive in a safe manner, ideally to a safe spot like parking on the side lane, without killing anyone. So, of course, we did that. We implemented it, we simulated it, because unlike you, we don't have a car in our lab. There are other labs at S&T who have a car and also driving autonomously, but since we are only the security people, no car, sorry. I tried. We simulated it, and we simulated it also under conditions where we don't have perfect connectivity. So where some of the cars might be able to communicate and see the other ones, and so on. One interesting result here is if you drive up to 20 kilometers per hour, you can have perfect coverage within a distance of 20 meters. And if you think about these numbers, I'm scared driving autonomously with the solutions which we have around now. Because de facto, what we are saying is, already when you are leaving your ego perspective for more than kind of 10 to 20 meters, then the uncertainty becomes so low at such a low velocity that you really can't drive autonomously anymore. And that was an interesting result from that paper. Of course, we also kind of simulated the asymptotic behavior. Essentially, we can deal with a lot of faults in the asymptotic case with a very high probability, and we can guarantee it under a certain connectivity level and so on. So that was the first idea which we did. But then, of course, we realized, yeah, well, if we have these other cars around, and essentially they are just computer system and they are sending us information, then, of course, you're running into attacks like the cyberattacks. So what is the cyberattack? It's essentially a car which is not there, but it pretends to be on the road. Now, you can do these kind of things with real cars somewhere around. So your trusted information, which you might have embedded into the car, doesn't really help you. You can just kind of pretend to be in a different location. You can also do that within a car, because essentially nothing prevents you from taking all these car communication systems, putting them into your trunk, and then driving around with 20 of them. And in fact, that's what this guy has been doing. He used a trolley with a lot of mobile phones, walked through the city and confused Google Maps that there is actually a traffic jam where he is. So this is kind of one of the examples of a cyberattack. Again, fortunately, he was a researcher and not someone real to cause traffic jams all over the place and serious damage, but you see it's possible. So what we did is we realized that cars are physical objects. So they also have physical properties, and to be safe, they have to adhere to certain physical rules. And one of these rules is it does not make sense to have two cars driving within the same overlapping region, because that would risk safety. If you are driving too closely to the car in front of you, and I know you are doing that, don't do it. It is dangerous. It's not safe. Now, what we can do is we detect that multiple cars are inside this location, assuming that we would have trusted location information. And in this situation, we can just rule out this car as being faulty. Now, of course, eventually you need to reach consensus on certain maneuvers. So assume you are at an intersection. It's again in the night, so you have just 3 cars trying to pass. And you try to agree with the others what to do. This situation is quite differently from the rush hour where you have a lot of cars. So now, should you build your system? Should you build your system in such a way that you always have to wait for a certain number of cars to pass? Because what we learned from the resilience protocols is if we have a number of replicas, with that number we can tolerate a maximum number of faults. Now, the problem is, with only the 3 cars, we might have only 1 fault. With the lot of cars during rush hour, we might have much more faults. Because, I mean, much more vehicles can go more often wrong in total, because each individual vehicle fails with a certain probability due to accidental causes. And then, of course, we have the attacker. The attacker might just kind of pick an arbitrary number of vehicles and manage to break into those. So in this situation, we are in this dilemma where the snake bites into its own tail, because to know the number of faults, we need to know n, the number of vehicles, and to know the number of vehicles in a reliable manner, we need to execute a reliable broadcast protocol. And for that, we need to decide eventually whether we can accept that information or not. And for that, we need to know the f. So how did we do that? Yeah, well, we opened up the reliable broadcast protocol and said, well, as a healthy replica, even though the message is not yet delivered, so it might be received, we might get the information from all these cars, including the rogue ones, but we are essentially not yet trusting that information. But we can already look at how valuable that information is. Like, we can already ignore all the cars which are at the same location. And we can already see from how many cars we received that information. So now, by turning it into a real-time system, which it is, we can actually say, if we don't receive messages after a certain amount of time, then something is wrong. So in this situation, we essentially know by the number of messages which we received from different cars which are not in overlapping situations, how many cars there are. From that, we can compute the f, and then we can go back into the reliable broadcast protocol and say, okay, did we receive confirmations which exceed which is kind of a majority of vehicles that would exceed that f, which we have just kind of looked at by digging deep into the internals of the protocol. If that's the case, then we have a reliable broadcast and we can deliver the information and we know exactly what the number of cars are, what the f is, and so on. So that required a certain trick, and that was actually Giulio's paper published last year at this year's VTC Spring conference, so a very nice result. Now, in all what I discussed so far, I have been only talking about the high-level stack, like how to secure perception. No, I didn't talk about how to secure perception, but that's also what we did. I talked about how to secure planning, and in particular, how to secure planning without buying essentially 4 Teslas to just get one, because, I mean, to replicate it to fault, you need kind of 4 times the autopilot from Tesla, maybe 2. Even for Luxembourgish ones. And then you have the control part, which we also worked on, and we cheated a little bit to bring down the number of replicas which we need to just f+1. But that's a dirty trick, and I won't talk about that today. What I would like to talk is about now the second part. We know how to kind of tolerate faults in a distributed system. But then again, there are these ECUs running our real-time operating systems, our kernels, and someone might still be able to break into such an operating system. So here's what we are doing. And again, sorry for the animation. Yeah. Let me explain what you see here first, and so what the animation steps are, and then I'll tell you what's happening. So the picture starts with just a line saying hypervisor, micro-hypervisor, or microkernel, whatever. Something which runs at the lowest level operating system layer, which controls your platform, which allows you to run Linux, and which maybe also allows you to run a real-time system next to it and a secure system next to it, or maybe a real-time and secure system, and so on. So these are the typical real-time operating systems or microkernel-based operating systems that you find in cars like Volkswagen today and so on. Now, the problem is what you could do. So the problem is you want to tolerate faults in such an operating system. So what we have learned is we could ideally chop that up into little components. And the little components, our micro-hypervisor replicas here, they would need to be isolated from each other because we can't allow a fault in that component to spread into the other. They would need to communicate because we ask them to reach consensus eventually. And they need to execute their own code, the protocol, and finally the applications on top. Now, unfortunately, this combination, a thing which isolates components, which allows programs to be executed, and which allows programs to communicate. So inter-process communication. That's exactly what a hypervisor does. It does nothing else. So that's the rudimentary functionality which you have in your operating system. And essentially, we are now saying in order to replicate a hypervisor, you need to build a hypervisor and so on. So that's a recursive system. We can't build it. So for that reason, we went back to German history and looked at Baron Münchhausen. And there is one nice thing. He pulls himself out of the swamp using a hairtail. And of course, this hairtail is a special hairtail because it's gravity defying. And so we need something, some trusted component to enable hypervisor replicas from protecting themselves and from recovering from themselves, essentially. So that we essentially end up with such a picture only, because we can't put another hypervisor under a hypervisor under a hypervisor and so on. Okay, how to do that? Yeah, well, we first have to realize that many cores are not distributed systems. They look like distributed systems. We have the individual tiles, individual cores, the FPGA slices, the GPUs, your accelerators, and so on, connected to an on-chip network. So it pretty much looks like a distributed system. But unfortunately, the current privilege settings are such that the moment you break into your memory management unit by manipulating page tables, you have full control over all system resources. And for that reason, an attacker which manages to break into the operating system level at one of these units is able to dominate the entire platform, and the faults can spread throughout the platform. And that's, of course, what we need to prevent. We essentially need to prevent software failures in the operating system, but also a subclass of hardware failures, namely those that don't burn the entire chips, that are only kind of flipping bits inside the state of a single tile, and which might only be communicated as messages over the network, that these are confined to these boundaries, because then what we can do is we can use these tiles as fault containment units, start replicas in the individual tiles, which give us the isolated execution. And then the only thing which we have to do is we have to make sure that they can communicate and reach agreement. Our application now would look like follows. We have hypervisor replicas controlling other parts in the system. And the other parts could be cores which run Linux, can run real-time applications, run secure applications. The applications can be replicated as well, as you see here in the secure application. But, and it's even possible to co-host applications on the hypervisor cores, but that's a little bit tricky. In particular, your application fails together with a hypervisor replica if locally you have your hypervisor compromised. So it's like if these two would be on the same core, the moment you are in the hypervisor, you also dominate this application replica here. So how do we do that? So first is we establish tiles as force containment domains without restricting whatever other resources they can access, because we don't want to build a partition system. If we want to build a partition system, that's known how we can do that. But then you lose all the benefits which you have from your many-core. We want to leverage the tight coupling, for example, to catch accidental faults using other techniques like ECC protection. But we don't really want to interfere much more with that. We don't want to assume that the system is perfect in terms of communication. And then we want to reduce the complexity of our trusted components so much that it should not even be required to execute a single line of code, because already that requires something of the complexity of an entire small core like the ARM M0, which you have in your mobile phone. And of course, we want to protect applications from the kernel. Now, we need to constrain the kernel replicas to do so. We can't rely on any infrastructure because there is nothing below us. And of course, we can't rely on crypto because crypto is way too expensive. We have something like 5,000 cycles to compute a Mac, HMac, versus 50 cycles for a cache-to-cache transfer. And ideally, anything that requires execution, as I mentioned, should run replicated on top of our architecture. So here's how we do it. We install a second level of protection mechanism. In our case, capabilities, but can be anything, can be page tables, can be something else, just to tell this tile is allowed to access these resources. And then we have an interface to use these capabilities, to invoke them. So the tile can say, I want to write this memory region. It invokes the capability to do so. The crux is to change the capability to reconfigure this unit, which is our trust component. You need to reach agreement, and you need to vote to change this capability. To be able to vote, you need a capability which allows you to vote. So in this kind of circular construction, or more or less circular construction, you can now pick an arbitrary tile, say you are a hypervisor, you get authority to vote over the to vote and to write in the configuration capabilities of all the other tiles. But it's only to cast a vote. So you can't give privileges on your own. You always have to agree with the other hypervisor replicas, with the majority of the hypervisor replicas, to give control. And that leads to an interesting system where you can play all kinds of tricks. So for example, you could agree that a certain replica, let's say the first hypervisor replica on the top left, gets access to an image to rejuvenate, without the others even having access to the same thing. So they are now managing these resources, but they can't get access to them because all the healthy hypervisor replica would say, if you want to give access to yourself, you can't. Only the one who you are rejuvenating will get this access. And that was quite a clever insight, but of course it's adding additional hardware, it's costly, and so on. So the last thing which we did in that domain so far is ask ourselves, can't we just do it by using the processor caches? And in fact, it turns out we can. If you go back all the way to the Byzantine generals problem and the problem with transferable authentication, you will see that essentially you can build consensus protocols which just work by transmitting oral messages, so messages which are whispered from one ear to the other ear. You can also do that in a way that you would transfer whatever the other has said. Like, Giulio could tell me something and I could tell you what Giulio has told me. This is transferable, or I'm transferring what Giulio told me. Now the problem is, if you have ear-to-ear messages, if I'm just whispering into your ear, I can lie about what he has told me. I can just make up something. And of course, traditionally, we would use crypto in order to get transferable authentication, because Giulio would sign his message and then I can do anything, I can tell anything, but I can't break the signature as long as I can't break the crypto algorithm. So in order to get the same benefit, what we make sure is we have memory, but we have memory in a way where you can flag it, you can tell it, I'm done writing, and then you can't modify that memory anymore. Now, in caches, that's just a simple check whether a certain cell has a flagged set, and then you prevent all the future write access, so an easy exercise in microcode. And this gives us a hardware mechanism that we need. And with that, we then build our structure such that each replica gets a buffer where he can write his own proposals, where he copies the proposal from the leader, and where he agrees or disagrees to that by simply setting flags. And then always say, okay, I'm now done making my arguments. I'm flagging them as done. And then they can't change their opinion anymore. Which now means, for the time being, we have in our buffer over the different replicas an agreed state, not where we need it, but actually in these kind of buffer structures, and we can use that as an agreement. So the third step is now to copy it essentially out with a classical copy operation, which says, if there is agreement, we just copy it to a destination and only once. So not to overwrite multiple times. Again, a small microcode program. Now the only thing which is left is we are losing buffer space over time, so the only thing which we still need is some kind of reset device, or we need to enter a trusted execution environment to eventually reset the entire thing and say, okay, now everything is writable again. So we did that as well and implemented it. It has nice performance. So the pink parts here is our protocol. MinBFT implementation without even client signatures is orders of magnitude more slow on such a system. So it demonstrates really you can't use crypto. And with that, I'm essentially already done. I hope I have showed you that we are late and we should catch up, not to be something like fusion, particle fusion, which they always say in 30 years we will have fusion. We have already spent our 30 years. We need to cope with cyber attacks in vehicles, both in the distributed manner and in the local manner. And I hope I have shown you at least 2 ideas how we can do that. And feel free to reach out to me. We are always looking for bright PhD students and postdocs to work with us, to follow in Julio's footsteps, to do some interesting research with us, and maybe come back and become professors here. So thanks a lot. Any questions?
Thank you, Professor. Any question?
Okay, at first, sorry for bad English, but is it when you're talking about hardware invasion, it seems like expensively computationally talking about. Is it really expensive to do these things, or the way you guys detect it and treat the problems?
It depends a bit on kind of what you mean by expensive. There are several cost factors here. Like, one is the cost factor, the additional costs in terms of number of transistors or hardware resources that you need to spend in order to implement the trusted components. In this kind of architecture, it's just a change of microcode. So it's a question of using up a little bit of flash memory in your processor when installing kind of a new setup. In the previous case, it is essentially these voters and the capability units. And that's only a few registers in hardware even. Because all that you need is you need some interface which interposes your tile and network on chip communication, which performs an additional privilege check. And it's essentially just kind of looking up what you have in your capability register and then performing the access or denying the access. So voting itself is just kind of, you do a string copy, a string compare between different elements. And we build it even in such a way that all the kind of error handling and detection of faults, like if one of the replicas makes a wrong proposal, that this happens in software, because we are freezing the state, and then the replicas need to first agree to reset the voter before they can use it again. And therefore, we can implement kind of error detection, error correction, rejuvenation entirely in software. So that's kind of the hardware overhead costs. Of course, when you need to tolerate faults by means of replication, you always pay the replication costs. And in that case, that's 3F plus 1 or 2F plus 1, depending on your system configuration, whether you are synchronous or asynchronous in your environment, and whether you have a trusted component or not. And that's something inevitable, because without perfect detection, you can't know whether a single unit produces a correct or incorrect result. And therefore, if you want to build a system where you can tolerate up to F failures, you need at least F plus 1 components to have one correct component giving you the result. And there's a question, and that's kind of what I didn't tell you when I made this check mark here about control. If you can collect these results over time, so if there is a way to reset your system and ask it again in a different configuration, so after recovery, is it really the correct thing? Is that really the correct thing for F plus 1 times? Then you can live with just F plus 1 replicas. If you need to mask the error earlier, then you need F plus 1 correct replicas to form a majority over F faulty replicas. And in that case, you are ending up with a 2f plus 1. So that's kind of fundamental costs. And without this dirty trick, which we applied for the control tasks, we were not yet able to solve that. No one was able to solve that. It's even an impossibility result about that from Nancy Fisher and Lynch. So, I mean, in this case, yeah, that's the cost which you need to pay. Then again, if you go into this kind of architecture, these cores for the hypervisor, they don't need your x86 Core i9 type of cores, the Adler Lake and so on. They can be just little things because all they need to do is get system call, execute the few instructions that the system call is comprised of. And in all other terms, it's just kind of a simple consensus algorithm plus a system call.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Any other question?
Any else? No. So I would like to ask some. I would like to know more about if you're looking to a specific metric like reliability or availability to put your replicas on different ways on your chip.
So what we are doing is we replicate the critical functionality to gain availability in the sense that faults are immediately masked. So you always have a healthy majority as long as you don't break the assumptions that simultaneously there are at most F faults. And with this majority, you can immediately continue operating. There is a caveat to that because if you have a replica which is attacked, then the attacker may play along. So he may rush and advance so much that the other replica, which is still healthy but slower, is just lagging behind. So in this case, it's not a problem because our shared knowledge is actually a memory state and the other replica can catch up independently. In a distributed system, that is a problem because you first need to bring the other replica up to speed. And one of the results which we just have published is that we prevent replicas from running ahead in real-time systems so much that this catch-up would be violating deadlines, would cause deadline misses. So that's kind of this replication. And then, of course, we need to reunite the replicas eventually because an adversary might learn how to break into that specific type of hypervisor replica. And for that, we need to diversify and to need to reboot. And in particular, we need to reboot before we can guarantee again that system calls are handled in a reliable manner. And for that case, we have here the replica pool. And there is also some element which I didn't show you because normally to rejuvenate, you need additional replicas which can then jump in and help in the rejuvenation. Because if you rejuvenate one healthy and you just have 3 replicas, then one healthy and one faulty remains. So to still be able to rejuvenate, you would need to add at least 1 additional replica so that you always have a healthy majority. Or in general, even 2 times the number of replicas which you want to rejuvenate. And we avoid all that trick by actually, again, applying a dirty trick. When we are rejuvenating a hypervisor replica, we don't kill it. We don't destroy its state. We force it to halt. And by forcing it to halt, we get a nice property because we can always go back to that replica and ask him, how would you have decided? So in this case, if we don't know whether a replica is actually faulty or not, then we can actually halt it. We can start rejuvenating it up to a point where we know that we can run forward. So all the critical operations are done. And then it can just boot into the new image and will eventually pop up as a correct replica again. If before that point we see that one of the other replicas denies the rejuvenation, and that's a fault which we can now detect by looking into the voter and seeing disagreement with the proposals of the others, then we can actually go back and restart that replica, resume it where we left it, and ask it, like, look here, we were rejuvenating you, there is this kind of operation. How would you vote? And with that, we get the identification which replica is faulty. So now we first reunite the faulty replica before returning back and proactively reuniting the healthy replica. And please excuse for me not putting up the slides in that 45 minutes talk.
Okay, no problem. Okay. Okay, one question here from YouTube. How can you produce the resilience reliability experiments?
How to produce them or how to reduce?
Reproduce.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So we have. Okay. There are a few answers to that. The first answer is some of our work, which we did in this software stack, has been together with a partner, so it's not IP owned by us. The second answer is there is a relatively complicated process in Luxembourg for open sourcing stuff at SNT. We are following that process occasionally, but not always. The Apollo stack is an open source software kit, so you can essentially take the paper, re-implement it, what we did, and reproduce it. And in particular, the only thing which we did here is essentially this affine projection from the predicted state into the predicted state of the vehicle which we want to help out. So in that sense, the entire simulation and so on, that's already part of the open source project. For the kernel work, that's again something which is kind of bound to IP restrictions, which I can't break. So in that sense, again, the paper is published. You can kind of look at it. There's also a patent filed about that, and kind of to use it, you would need to license the thing. Yeah, I mean, the papers contain the pseudocode, so you can repeat the measurement, the experiments.
Okay, any more?
Hi, good afternoon. Earlier in the presentation, you talked about the high level. Can I say about when some unit is attacked somehow, it needs to recover, and it somehow changes the way it behaves in order to avoid future corruption, right?
Yes.
Wasn't? Yeah. No, yeah. Like it changes in order to be more resilient. Yeah. Does this also happens in low level when you talked about more like in hardware level? Those units you're talking about, when they are attacked, these units, they also have to recover and change the way this protocol, this safety protocol they use too.
Yeah. Yes, exactly. So what happens here is we need different versions. So a fault or an attack crafted here does not automatically apply. And that can, for example, be you have a specific attack which uses your address space layout and tries to use return-oriented programming to produce an attack code. And the same attack code should not apply for all the replicas. So you re-randomize your address space layout whenever you are doing that. Now, that's a relatively simple countermeasure. It's known how to break it and so on. But there are also more complicated diversification schemes. For the kernel, we are essentially having to do the same thing, but we are faced with the problem that we can't have yet a compiler infrastructure and a system up and running to produce these replicas, and in particular to produce these inverse instances. So let me just jump to the very end. So what we did instead is we created essentially an interface so that you can provide these instances externally. And now that means if you are connected, you can have somewhere a server farm which generates more or less continuously these diverse replica images, and it randomly distributes individual images to the individual nodes. And then there is an instance on the server which just validates whether they are correct and puts them into the pool. Now, once they are in this pool and understands that this pool is memory, which is not readable by anything which runs on that software, because to be readable, you need a majority of the hypervisor replicas to agree to give read access to one arbitrary processing element to such a replica here. They are writable by this external server, but not readable by anything in the system. So if within that system you have an adversary, he can't already have a look at them. He can't analyze them ahead of time. And now the moment when you're rejuvenating, then the still healthy hypervisor replicas need to agree to give read access to the first such image to the one which you are rejuvenating. So for example, they give H3 now this red line dashed read access here to the blue image. And by doing so, they are also using up that image, because now essentially the adversary has seen that image and can start analyzing it, how to break into it and so on. And really the crux here is that we remain faster than the adversaries can mount these kind of attacks in supplying and rejuvenating replicas. So we need to rejuvenate all n replicas faster than the adversary needs to break into more than f replicas, which we have.
But these images, are they like static in the memory? That they're already there and they're used, or they can be changing over time as...
So there is an input feed coming from this external server or a local diversifying instance. And that is simply a program which can run on top of the program and kind of create these images, even in a replicated manner, because it can now leverage that it runs in a hypervisor system and so on. The moment and kind of installing such an image, that's just a matter of writing the data into memory finally.
It can do it dynamically.
It can do that dynamically, or it can kind of receive the pre-packaged, pre-generated images and just installs it down there.
No, because my question was, if it was like static, I thought like maybe this image, this new random delivered image to this cell, they could still be affected by the I mean, even if it's a different image, they could be vulnerable.
You can kind of try to attack the supply chain of these images by trying to break the crypto, by trying to tamper with the messages and so on. So you need to spend a bit of intelligence to write this in a secure manner and to only install images which are encrypted so that you don't see them, which are signed so that you detect modifications and so on. But this can be done by an application, because the application can already utilize the hypervisors. As long as there is at least one image always in the buffer, you can rejuvenate one hypervisor. And while you can rejuvenate always one hypervisor, your application can safely run on top of a hypervisor-based system. So the critical part here is that we can't kind of diversify inside the hypervisor in such a situation, because that's simply an operation which is too complex, too large. It requires a compiler and so on and so forth. So we had to push that up to user level. And to do so, we kind of came up with this idea of having a pool where only the diversifier can write, and in an append-only fashion. So it can write and then it will lose the access. And only the rejuvenating hypervisor replica gets read access. And that's possible because any access must be given in a consensual manner.
One last question.
Sure.
You showed like from autonomous vehicles, the research in autonomous vehicles, fault tolerance mechanism, and also in like cores and systems on chips. In which other domains do you see like applying your research? Like the system on chips, or the research for fault tolerance on systems on chips, like other domains, other applications that we could apply that, and how you compare like this kind of applications, this kind of research with the current state of arts that are in the autonomous vehicles nowadays.
Yeah, so state-of-the-art autonomous vehicles, if I can answer the last question first. There is a lot of trust on suppliers and finally the car vendors who vouch having their own contract for the correctness of the software stack. There are intrusion detection systems coming more and more often. There are kind of systems to verify and to only install verified instances of new software stacks. But as the complexity of these software stacks grow, and I mean, for autonomous vehicles, we are talking about something like 3 billion lines of code to drive autonomously. That's something which no one can guarantee that it's free of vulnerabilities or free of faults. So in that sense, we will probably see these kinds of faults happening. Now, back to your first question, I think we need to explore fault tolerance and build systems fault and intrusion tolerant and resilient. And we need to do that for essentially all systems. Because what we have learned is that the moment we operate on critical data, and that can be data as simple as the car taking a video image of yourself standing in front of a certain house where there is maybe a psychotherapist. So just this simple information, a single image, can already reveal that you might have a mental illness. And I don't want to have that information in China. I don't want to have it in the US. I don't want to have it in Europe in the things. And the car manufacturer should not have this information in the first place. So in this regard, we need to kind of build systems fault and intrusion tolerant and privacy preserving secure. And it doesn't matter which one. So domains which we are looking into is autonomous driving, because that's where we started with as an application scenario. Both inside the car and the collaborative sense. We look into space, so satellites and asteroid mining, because when someone tells me the first asteroid mining company, the boss will be a billionaire, then I know who will attack the information about this asteroid and where it is and how to mine it and jeopardize that mission. I mean, there's simply too much at stake. And same for all kind of critical infrastructure, so our electricity grid and all kinds of systems that we depend on. And we need to make them dependable. We need to make them resilient to cyber attacks. So in that sense, essentially it's all systems we are still busy for a few years.
Hi, thanks for your talk. My main question is about the last answer you just gave to the previous question, about the motivation of the context of autonomous vehicles and autonomous driving. Do you think that in the era of software-defined vehicles, do you think what are the lessons that you can learn from different domains, from different scenarios, for example, the mobile development, the internet and stuff like that? What are the lessons in terms of the cyber attacks, in terms of resilience that we can learn and can bring to the autonomous vehicles industry, for example?
Yeah, I think there are a few lessons learned, and we are not learning them in a way because we are repeating the same mistakes ever and ever in all domains. You start with just worrying about functionality, and that means designs typically ignore security from the beginning. They ignore resilience from the beginning. They just try to build something together which seems to work in normal situations. And our tools have become so good that we can build systems which work in 95% of all the cases pretty much as we expect them. AI is something where we can even kind of get to this 95% without actually building it, because we can just train it with a lot of data. The problem is always this tail. And the moment a system becomes more complex than a single person can manage, and we used to be at that point where we trusted our hardware ultimately, and there were only software faults, and software was getting too complex. That's when kind of Linux exceeded a million lines of code, for example. And we realized, okay, there are faults happening which we can't explain, there are attacks happening, and so on. And the system, because functionality was always the first goal, and there was never really a design for security, a design for resilience from day one onwards. We saw it essentially failing in that regard. So they are catching up with using safe languages. They are also catching up with reorganizing things. So I'm not speaking against Linux, and I don't want to even mention Windows and the other operating systems here. But it's something where simply by the way these systems are constructed, you buy in a lot of complexity, and with a lot of complexity, you get a lot of vulnerabilities. We are seeing the same effect with hardware chips now, that we get side channel attacks and these transient execution attacks simply because they are so complex. For performance and functionality reasons, we had to include all these nice little features like speculation and out-of-order processing and branch prediction and so on, and they are now violating all our security principles. With autonomous driving, same thing, and with a lot of other systems also. I would say what we need really is fundamental research, how to build resilient systems from the start onwards. I grew up with microkernels and microkernel-based systems. That was one of the ideas. Like, you build your system in such a way that you only need to trust something like 20,000 lines of code, but you pay a performance penalty of 5%. And then it's not that whatever you build on top of it is automatically trusted. It's just that kind of failures in one component are isolated because they can't easily reach into the next component. But we don't yet have a principled way of dealing with these kind of things. Replication is the one thing which seems to work, but I didn't talk too much about the diversification side of it. I don't know how to do that. I don't know how to do that in a way that I can maintain timing guarantees. I don't know how to do that in a way that it's dynamic and fast enough for disconnected systems, for IoT systems, and so on. So there will be a bit of research left.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Any more? No? So I would like to thank Julio and Professor Volpe to join us and share some important information. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, and thank you to join us and share some important informations. I believe it will be a good directions for research collaborations also. Okay, many thanks.
Yeah, I have to thank that I am actually allowed and invited here to speak at the place where actually I got one of yours, Julio, who came to my team, who did part of that research. So thanks a lot for allowing me to share that with you. And yes, hopefully we can collaborate in the future on something.